Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time you happen to be watching this. I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're going to go through Ordinary Grace. The title slide here talks about pages 241 through 262. That's a bit of a lie because this is going to be more of a subject matter question than it's going to be a plot overview where we're going to go sequentially, chronologically in the plot of the novel. The question I've got is there enough of 1961 or is there too much 2014 and we'll just extend it out to 2023 because the 9 years between 2014 and 2023 offer far fewer changes than the difference between 1961 and 2014 or the difference between 1961 and 2023. The vast majority of you get your news, get your humor, get your information, get your contact, your family discussion via social media. None of that existed in 1961. There was snail mail, there were telephone calls, but a lot of things like humor came either from television or from things like Mad Magazine. And yes, there were comedy albums that people put out, but the vast majority of things were in print, not digital, and it was all paper. And it was just a different way of waiting weekly, perhaps monthly, to get the newest thing, as opposed to dealing with things in your pocket instantaneously. And people had to wait either to have it delivered by mail or to go to some sort of newsstand to get the magazine, whether it's a news magazine or, in this case, Mad Magazine, a humor magazine. The book has at least all of the social issues on the screen. There's discussion of bullying, there's teen pregnancy, there's domestic abuse, there's homelessness, there's abuse of power, there's a wealth gap, there's suicide attempts, there's people with disabilities, there's a brief mention and discussion of migrant workers, there's Native American issues being discussed, there are issues of sexuality, and there's conversation about PTSD. The early part of the book, Gus discusses people uh, bullying Bobby Cole. And his insight about the things that people said to him were as hurtful as throwing stones. There's a difference, I think, between the bullying here, where it's adults, the Christian folk. He's not talking to the kids in the church, he's talking to the Christian folk, the adults in the church, versus the vast majority of bullying that was shown on TV, whether in this case from this picture, the Andy Griffith Show, where Opie gets bullied and then Opie finally punches the bully in the nose and everybody lives happily ever after, are different than the idea of the harm of words. 1961, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. This is a far different insight than what I remember being taught growing up. On the other hand, the US teen birth rate has fallen dramatically over time, and yet if you take a look right around 1957, 58, 59, um, was when it was the highest. It was slipping a little bit in 61 when this book was written, but it's still kind of at an all time high. And so the teen pregnancy in this book makes perfect sense. The out of wedlock teen pregnancy, we can argue about a little bit, but this is an accurate reflection of 1961. And I think it's important to take a look at both where it's accurate and where it's inaccurate. Domestic abuse. You take a look at the poster for the John Wayne flick. One would argue that this is complete and total domestic abuse, and there seems to be something of a joke about it. Here, the book deals it much more seriously, and it talks about the effect of not only the husband beating the wife, but the husband hitting the child. They it isn't turned into some sort of a joke, um, and it's treated much more seriously than I think pop culture, certainly in the 1960s, treated it. And I'm not sure if this was late 1950s, early 1960s, but certainly the Macho Man John Wayne and the attempt to get subservience from the the wife of the book um, is a big um, you know joke in the movie. Here they're treating it much more seriously, and that's about all I can give. I don't have any personal experience of people talking about it, or any memory of people talking about domestic abuse from when I was growing up. Doyle talks about homelessness and sickness, and a lot of it is perhaps, again, an effect of PTSD from World War II and from the Korean War. And once again, mass media, in this case, the Red Skelton program, homelessness, itinerants, Freddie the Freeloader, the bum, was dealing with a situation and trying to turn it into something of a joke. That wasn't true for everything. I mean, Steinbeck certainly dealt with social issues seriously, and people being forced out of their homes during the Depression, uh, other times, but there still, it seems to me, in the 1960s, was an effort to deal with this sort of thing as a joke instead of dealing with it seriously. The novel doesn't seem to pick up the idea of the joke, and I think it's important. The novel, the idea of mental health being something that should be dealt with seriously, even Doyle, who is as insensitive as they come, tries to, I think, get people to think about the idea of the mental health issues that some of the homeless have. And that, I think, is something that I know wasn't talked about in the 1960s. The cops kind of abusing their power certainly happened in the 1960s. Here, Doyle spray paints the truth where the world can see it. You rub their noses in it a little bit. Again, the 1960s, the TV show Dragnet, the cops were always upright, the cops were always perfect. Joe Friday was just asking for the facts. All of that, I think, is an important reminder, again, of media being used for propaganda almost at some level, especially with the TV show Dragnet, as opposed to media being used to expose a few truths about how things aren't always as perfect as they seem. Ordinary Grace tries to, I think, remind us that the 1960s were not as perfect as what they might seem. I think this is an important distinction and something that the novel does really well. The wealth gap. The Brants were as near to royalty as you'd find in the Midwest. They lived in the Heights. They had the pillared mansion. They had a view of the town below. And there was a wealth gap. If you look at the chart, 1962, they show on there $100,000, 5% lived over that. 40% had an income level somewhere close to 50,000 for the family. 20% were below the 20,000 level, something like that. You look now, the wealth gap has grown. The wealth gap is much larger than what it was. There was certainly talk between rich and poor. There was certainly the idea that there are people, the rich are not like us for the poor people, but the wealth gap, I think, if you just look at this chart, going again to 2012, closer to when the novel was written, how fast it's growing, how the wealthiest 5% have just kept climbing and climbing and climbing. The base level income that was right at 100 or right at $50,000 in 1962 is at 75,000 now in 2012. I think that perhaps this was a little bit too much 2014 and not quite enough 1961. The suicide rate has spiked and gone down, and from 1950 at the very beginning through 2017, you'll notice that there's been climbs towards the end of that. But again, you'll notice that around 1960, 1950s, there were spikes in the suicide rate, which would again accurately reflect what, the novel accurately reflects what's going on there. Liz Brent had been born deaf and difficult. She received what schooling could be given from special tutors and had no future anyone could see. One of the things I just want to point out is that South Dakota had a school for the blind and visually impaired. South Dakota and a lot of other states had a school for the deaf. Yankton is home to a mental health facility. And people who were blind, people who were disfigured, people who were injured, were oftentimes just kind of shut off in these special schools for the blind, schools for the deaf. And the education just was to keep them separate from everybody else. What schooling you could be given from special tutors, this works for the Brants because they were rich. And I think it's important, again, to take a look here. How much of this was 1961? It seems to be pretty accurate. 2014, she would have been in school. There would have been special ed classes. There would have been uh, help for her that would have had her interact with regular students. There would have been a mainstreaming effort that just wasn't there in the 1960s. So this, I think, once again, he's doing a great job of uh, portraying accurately what was going on then. The migrant workers. My grandfather spoke of the influx of Mexican farm workers and how it was bringing an unwelcome element to the valley, and my father asked how the farmers were supposed to get work done without the help of migrants. The grandfather, I think, is entirely accurate of what was happening in the 1960s. I don't know how accurate Nathan is. I don't know how accurate Ruth is in one of the upcoming slides of presenting the view of the migrants are necessary, the migrants should be treated better, and Ruth's view about homosexuality in the upcoming slides. I don't know how accurate that view was. I don't know how predominant that view was, especially among Mexican, Methodist ministers. There might have been a certain bohemian element that held that view. I don't know how many people would have actually held that view. Native American issues, I think, are really accurately portrayed here. The idea of Native Americans in my education was reflected by books like Chief Blackhawk, reflected by books about the there was a Squanto and the Pilgrims. There were other books like that. The idea of how the Native Americans were actually treated by the white majority was never really developed. Certainly, the ideas of warriors being hanged in one day never talked about. None of that stuff was talked about. I think it's accurate, very, very accurate, all the way through. And the only thing I wonder about is how much somebody like Warren would have been allowed to talk to somebody like Frank. That's the only thing I wonder about. But I think this was a perfectly accurate, perfectly 1961 description. I'm willing to give Kruger a pass on Ruth saying if you got to say anything, say homosexual. It was a term my mother employed occasionally in her discussion of artists. And, the word fag was a word you picked up and used like a sharp stick. Certainly, that phrasing in the last sentence was accurate through the 1960s, through the 1970s. I'm giving Ruth something of a pass because of her, sort of musical background, her visits to New York, the things that would have allowed her to become more, acquainted with the homosexual community of the 1960s. That would have been an extremely liberal view in the early 1960s, but I'm willing to give her a pass that at least the discussion was happening. I don't remember much discussion about homosexuality until the early 1970s. After Stonewall, um, there were certain mentions of it in broader newscasts and everything else, but there really wasn't much until then. And then just kind of a quick reminder of what Stonewall was, since I brought it up earlier. Um, the Chappaquiddick political scandal for Ted Kennedy, the moon landing, Woodstock, but the clash at the Stonewall Inn, um, it inspired the gay civil rights movement and may have been the thing that created a you know a, the push that allowed the gay civil rights movement to succeed. However, it was treated as a large news story, and most of the big media, Time, Newsweek, whatever, never covered the riot, they're causing it an uprising, but it was basically a riot in 1969. Those of you who are watching this on video, uh, the PTSD element, um, and how it was kind of covered up, I think is accurate from the 1940s through the 1960s. When I was growing up, there was a neighbor who collected all the scrap cars you could possibly have because he was afraid the Japanese were going to buy up the scrap metal and bomb the United States again. And he was suffering from PTSD. He lived in terrible conditions. Neighbors tried to take care of him a little bit, um, but a lot of it was this idea of shell shock affecting him. And in class, we'll take a look at the Carlin video. There'll be a link in the description box below. I usually don't do this, but this is going to be the daily writing. I just want your opinion on whether the book is too filled with 2023 social cultural issues or whether the book is fine as it is and that the social and cultural issues add to the uh, depth of the storytelling. I hope everyone has a good day, and I hope to see you all in the next class period.